On a gray February afternoon in 1943, deep inside the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin, Hermann Göring leaned back in his oversized leather chair, twirling a jeweled baton between his fingers. Reports of American industrial mobilization lay spread across his desk: charts, tonnage forecasts, shipping projections, and above all, the staggering new claim that the United States was aiming for an annual aircraft output of 50,000 planes. Göring didn't merely dismiss it, he laughed. A loud, theatrical, almost operatic laugh that echoed down the marble corridor. 50,000, he scoffed to his adjutants. Americans can build refrigerators and automobiles, yes, but fighter planes? Bombers? Engines? They lack the discipline, they lack the spirit, they lack the blood. His aides smiled nervously, because that was the correct response in that room. And Göring, inflated by his own certainty, marked the report with a red pencil. Unrealistisch, unmöglich. But outside that insulated chamber of mirrors, thousands of miles away, the foundations of a very different reality were shaking the earth itself. From Buffalo to Burbank, Detroit to Dallas, furnaces roared day and night. Conveyor belts clattered with a rhythm more relentless than artillery fire. Women in blue overalls riveted metal skins onto bomber frames with a speed that rewrote every assumption about industrial labor. Teenagers, fresh out of trade school, were assembling engines whose complexity rivaled anything produced in Munich or Stuttgart. Engineers, economists, and logisticians, none of whom Göring ever bothered to imagine, were carving the blueprint for something unprecedented. A country transforming itself into an arsenal vast enough to fight wars on two oceans simultaneously. By 1944, the Americans would not produce 50,000 aircraft. They would produce 96,270, not merely surpassing their own goal, but outbuilding the entire German aviation industry by a factor of more than 3. And yet the tragedy, the dark humor, and the historic irony lie not only in the numbers, but in Göring's absolute, unbreakable confidence. He genuinely believed that the United States, despite its population, its machines, its natural resources, and its unmatched manufacturing culture, was incapable of producing high-performance aircraft on a scale that would reshape the war. His worldview made such an outcome unthinkable. To Göring, industrial might was not a question of engineering or economics. It was a question of ideology. He was convinced that only authoritarian discipline, German discipline, could forge a modern air force. America, in his mind, was an undirected mass of consumers, profiteers, and immigrants whose factories produced abundance, but not excellence. A nation of comfort, not sacrifice. A nation of individualism, not hierarchy. The man who had once commanded the most advanced air force on Earth could not fathom that democracy, pluralism, and mass production were not obstacles to wartime strength. They were its engines. This blindness did more than distort Göring's understanding of his enemy. It paralyzed his strategic judgment. Every time American aircraft appeared in greater numbers over North Africa, Italy, and the Reich itself, Göring rationalized the evidence away. He blamed British exaggeration. He blamed inflated intelligence estimates. He blamed traitors, lazy workers, even the weather. But he never blamed himself. That is what makes this moment in 1943 more than a historical footnote. It is the turning point where a global conflict collided with a man's ideological delusions, and the man lost. Because by the time Göring's laughter faded into historical memory, the skies over Europe would carry a different sound. Not the proud roar of the Luftwaffe he once built, but the steady, overwhelming thunder of American air fleets. Thousands of silver wings stretching from horizon to horizon, bombing rail lines, factories, cities, and fuel depots with such volume that no German planner, even the most brilliant, could devise a remedy. This transformation was not inevitable. Industrial miracles never are. It required political unity, staggering logistical control, an economic redirection unprecedented in human history, and a workforce that broke every gender and age expectation of its era. But Göring's failure was not simply underestimating American machinery. He underestimated American belief that a free people could outproduce any dictatorship, belief that open society could mobilize with an intensity rivaling that of any fascist state. belief that numerical might was not a symptom of weakness, but a manifestation of national will. What began as a mocking laugh inside a Berlin office would become one of the most catastrophic miscalculations of the Third Reich. Göring had built his reputation on the idea that he alone understood air power. But when confronted with the reality that the war's decisive front would be a factory floor, not a dogfight, he was blind. This is the story of how ideological arrogance buried strategic thinking, how a superpower was dismissed as a myth until its assembly lines became the greatest military engine ever created, and how a man who believed he understood the skies found himself crushed not by pilots or tacticians, but by welders, planners, and industrial workers he never imagined worthy of fear. Before the end of the war, Göring would reluctantly admit to a captured American officer, "I knew your factories were good. I did not know they were limitless." But by then, the consequences of his blindness were irreversible. For in a single year, 1944, America produced more aircraft than Germany had built from 1939 to 1944 combined. The laugh in that Berlin office had long since died away. Only the echo of its mistake remained. In the winter of 1942, as Germany's military tide began its slow and irreversible ebb, Hermann Göring grew ever more reliant on a worldview that insulated him from reality. It was a worldview built on hierarchy, racial dogma, and an almost mystical belief in German exceptionalism, an ideological prism that distorted every strategic fact confronting the Reich. To understand why he laughed at the idea of America building 50,000 aircraft, one must first understand the intellectual cage Göring had forged around himself. At the core of Göring's thought was a conviction rooted not in economics, but in biology. He believed that industrial excellence was a racial inheritance, not a technical achievement. The German worker, in his mind, was inherently superior in discipline, craftsmanship, and mechanical intuition. American workers, immigrants, minorities, women, and blue-collar laborers drawn from every imaginable background did not fit into his mental model of a people capable of sustaining high-precision, high-tempo aircraft production. He did not merely underestimate them, he dismissed them as categorically incapable. This dismissal extended beyond the workforce. Göring believed that a democratic nation, fragmented by political compromise and civilian oversight, could never redirect its economy with the ruthlessness needed for an industrialized war. He saw Congress as a weakness, public debate as a vulnerability, and decentralization as a fatal flaw. In his speeches to the Luftwaffe's senior staff, he often insisted that totalitarian unity was the prerequisite for total war, and therefore the Reich possessed an advantage no free society could match. Yet this ideological stance blinded him to an essential truth. The United States did not mobilize like Germany. It mobilized faster. While Göring equated coercion with efficiency, America leveraged competition, flexibility, and innovation. The very features that Göring mocked, its consumer culture, its automotive giants, its diverse labor pool, were the engines that made large-scale aircraft production not only possible, but inevitable. But from his vantage point, America's strengths appeared as flaws because they violated his ideological assumptions. One of the most revealing episodes occurred in late 1942, when Albert Speer, the newly appointed armaments minister, attempted to brief Göring on the scale of American industrial mobilization. Speer presented photographs of Detroit factories retooled for bomber assembly, production charts showing exponential increases in output, and reports from German naval intelligence about shipping traffic expanding at unprecedented rates. Göring glanced through the material, snorted dismissively, and said, "Statistics are inventions. I trust what I know of the American character." But what Göring knew was a myth. His worldview had no space for the truth that American industry had been the world's largest before the war, that its machine tool capacity dwarfed anything in Europe, that its access to oil, steel, and aluminum was unmatched, or that its academic and engineering institutions were producing innovations at a pace the Reich could not rival. At staff meetings, when intelligence officers warned that the Allies' aircraft losses were being replenished faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down, Göring dismissed the figures as exaggerations designed to demoralize the Reich. His response was not analytic, it was emotional. He insisted that American planes were inferior, their pilots untrained, and their air strategy disorganized. These assertions were illusions, but they were illusions with consequences. Göring's ideological rigidity froze the Luftwaffe's strategic thinking at a moment when adaptation was essential for survival. Instead of preparing for a sustained air production arms race, he clung to the belief that German quality would defeat American quantity. Even as the war shifted toward attrition, on a scale the Luftwaffe was structurally incapable of enduring. The very idea that quantity could be a form of quality, a principle deeply embedded in American industrial philosophy, never entered Göring's calculations. This ideological rigidity affected procurement decisions as well. Göring favored cutting-edge aircraft designs that required extensive handcrafting, complex machining, and highly skilled labor. The Luftwaffe pursued experimental fighters and bombers, whose production times were far too long to compensate for mounting losses. American planners, by contrast, prioritized standardization and manufacturability. They built aircraft that were not perfect, but that could be produced in extraordinary numbers, maintained easily, and repaired quickly in the field. Göring's ideological bias also shaped his response to the entry of African Americans and women into the American industrial labor force. Nazi racial doctrine labeled these groups as inferior, and Göring absorbed this doctrine so deeply that he viewed their involvement in manufacturing as evidence of American weakness. In reality, their participation was one of the greatest strengths of the American war effort. Women filled assembly lines with unprecedented efficiency. African American workers, after long struggles against discrimination, contributed massively to wartime industry, particularly in steel, aircraft engine construction, and shipbuilding. Göring could not understand that a society willing to transform its labor base was a society capable of extraordinary mobilization. His ideology made him blind to the dynamism of the American workforce, blind to the possibility that empowerment, rather than compulsion, could fuel productivity. Even on the eve of the Allied bombing campaign that would devastate German industry, Göring clung to his illusions. When American B-17s first appeared over the Reich in mass formations, he insisted they represented Britain's overextended resources, not America's expanding capacity. He refused to believe that the United States could maintain sustained daylight bombing pressure while simultaneously increasing its aircraft output every month. This blindness was not just personal. It infected the Luftwaffe's command culture. Generals who questioned Göring's assumptions risked humiliation or dismissal. The result was a leadership structure where truth flowed upward only when it matched Göring's expectations. Intelligence that contradicted his worldview was filtered, softened, or withheld entirely. Germany's aviation engineers understood the scale of the danger. Men like Kurt Tank, Willy Messerschmitt, and Ernst Heinkel warned that without radical production expansion, the Luftwaffe would be overwhelmed numerically. But Göring believed the war would be won by superior design, not superior output. He believed the Me-262 jet would turn the tide, even though he repeatedly interfered with its development. He believed that German pilots could compensate for material shortages through fighting spirit. He believed that Allied bombing would cripple American output, ignoring the fact that the United States was beyond the reach of German aircraft. All of these miscalculations flowed from one source: ideology over reality. By the time Göring finally acknowledged the scale of America's industrial ascendancy, it was too late. The Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging aircraft, pilots, and fuel. German factories operated under constant bombardment. Ersatz materials replaced aluminum. Teenagers were being trained as fighter pilots in courses so accelerated they bordered on suicidal. And yet, across the Atlantic, America's assembly lines were accelerating, not slowing. The very attributes Göring mocked: mass production, standardization, workforce diversity, decentralized innovation, were producing a storm of aircraft whose volume no German planner could match. Göring's laughter in 1943 was not merely arrogance. It was the sound of a man imprisoning himself inside an ideology that could not survive contact with the modern world. His error was not in failing to predict the exact number of American aircraft. His error was believing that numbers did not matter, believing that spirit could replace steel, believing that superiority could be declared rather than demonstrated. This is the first pillar of the tragedy. Göring did not lose to American industry. He lost to his own convictions. If Göring's worldview created the blindness, then America's wartime industrial transformation provided the shock that shattered it. To understand why Germany never recovered from this miscalculation, one must step inside the American factories that the Reich refused to believe existed. What unfolded between 1942 and 1944 was not merely a surge in production, it was a national metamorphosis, an industrial revolution compressed into the span of a single campaign season. At the center of this transformation was a decision unprecedented in the history of modern democracies. The United States willingly dismantled its civilian economy and rebuilt it into an engine of total war. The momentum began in 1940, when President Roosevelt challenged American industry to produce 50,000 planes a year. Newspapers mocked the number. Congressmen questioned it. German observers called it impossible. But the challenge ignited something dormant in the American psyche, a belief that the nation's vast, sprawling industrial web could be reconfigured on a scale no single corporation, no matter how massive, had ever attempted. The first sign of what was coming appeared in Detroit. The automotive capital of the world possessed not only the machinery, but the organizational genius required for war production at scale. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler were accustomed to manufacturing thousands of vehicles every day. What they lacked in military experience, they compensated for with unparalleled efficiency in mass production, assembly line engineering, and workforce management. And when the call came, they mobilized with a ferocity that stunned even their own executives. Ford's Willow Run plant became the cathedral of this new industrial faith. Rising out of Michigan farmland at breakneck speed, Willow Run was designed to do something no other factory on Earth had ever achieved: build a 4-engine heavy bomber as if it were a family sedan. The B-24 Liberator, notoriously complex with more than 450,000 individual parts, had been a bottleneck for aircraft manufacturers. Ford approached it with an entirely different philosophy: break it down, standardize it, mechanize it, and let the assembly lines swallow its complexity. The results defied every expectation. By early 1944, Willow Run was producing 1 B-24 per hour, 24 aircraft each day, a level of output that German engineers considered a statistical impossibility. The Luftwaffe required months to deliver a similar number of heavy bombers. Even when German factories operated at peak efficiency under Speer's reforms, nothing in the Reich approached the scale of Willow Run's hypnotic mechanical thunder. Detroit was not alone. Across the country, a network of production giants came online. In California, Consolidated Vultee and Lockheed turned the West Coast into a metropolis of aluminum wings. Their factories stretched for miles, lit by overhead lamps that rendered night indistinguishable from day. Workers, many of them women who had never touched a power tool before, riveted, welded, and assembled airframes in shifts that continued without pause, from January through December. In New York, Buffalo's Curtiss plant became a storm of propellers and engines. In Ohio, the Wright Aeronautical Corporation perfected the assembly line production of radial engines with a precision that astonished foreign observers. In Kansas City, North American aviation rolled out the P-51 Mustang in waves, its sleek frame emerging from the production line like a symbol of the new American war machine, fast, deadly, and seemingly endless in number. And still, Göring insisted it was theater, numbers fabricated, output exaggerated, democracy incapable of such focus. But the raw volume told a different story. In 1940, America produced fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. By 1941, the figure reached 18,000. In 1942, 47,000. In 1943, 85,000. And in the decisive year of 1944, 96,270 aircraft poured out of U.S. factories: fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, enough to replace the entire Luftwaffe every 5 weeks. This was not simply manufacturing, it was mobilization on a civilizational scale. The key to this miracle was not brute force, but systems thinking. American industrial planners pioneered a new way of organizing production, breaking tasks into modular steps, distributing work across a national network of subcontractors, and designing supply chains that spanned the continent. Thousands of small machine shops produced components for larger plants. Steel from Pennsylvania flowed to fuselage factories in California. Rubber from the South fed engine assembly lines in the Midwest. Aluminum ingots traveled by rail in quantities so massive they reshaped regional economies. Where Germany centralized production and guarded expertise behind military bureaucracy, America decentralized and democratized it. A machinist in Cleveland could build a component for a bomber assembled in Texas by workers trained in Colorado with materials forged in Chicago. This distributed model made American industry resilient. No single bombing raid, no single logistical disruption could cripple it. Another pillar of the American surge lay in its ability to apply private sector speed to military demands. Production methods were not dictated by uniformed officers who lacked industrial experience. They were designed by the engineers and managers who had built the most efficient consumer goods networks in the world. Where the German economy struggled to harmonize military priorities with competing political factions, the American system placed industrialists like William Knudsen, Henry Kaiser, and Charles Sorensen at the helm. These men were not merely administrators. They were visionaries who understood how to bend steel, labor, and logistics into a machine greater than the sum of its parts. Henry Kaiser's shipyards illustrate this transformation. Though not part of aircraft production directly, the philosophy he refined, radical simplification, standardized modules, and parallel workflows, would influence aircraft plants nationwide. Kaiser's workers famously reduced the construction time of a Liberty ship from months to mere days. This was not a factory, it was a statement. Anything, no matter how complex, could be mass-produced if broken into pieces and built with relentless coordination. American aircraft manufacturers adopted this doctrine with zeal. Standardization became sacred. Every bolt, every bracket, every landing gear assembly followed strict tolerances. Unlike German aircraft, which required skilled craftsmen to hand-fit components, American airframes were so precisely manufactured that parts from one factory could be installed in a plane built 2,000 miles away without modification. This precision empowered rapid repairs on the front lines and enabled the non-stop tempo of Allied air operations. The workforce driving this machine represented another American advantage that Göring failed to imagine. The German labor system, constrained by ideology, forced millions of foreign laborers into conditions that bred resentment, sabotage, and inefficiency. In contrast, the American workforce, though far from perfect in its treatment of minorities and women, operated on a fundamentally different principle: participation, not coercion. Women accounted for more than a third of aircraft workers by 1943. They mastered the delicate tasks of riveting, wiring, and machining with an intensity that shocked early supervisors. African American workers, after years of exclusion and discrimination, joined aircraft production in growing numbers, often exceeding output expectations. Their work, meticulous, disciplined, and indispensable, would become one of the quiet engines of Allied victory. Immigrants, union members, engineers, farmers, former store clerks, recent high school graduates. Together they formed a workforce bound not by racial ideology, but by shared purpose. The American factory floor became a mosaic of identities, united by a common goal: outbuild the Axis powers until the sky itself bent under the weight of American aircraft. Even internal competition played a role. Factories published production charts, pitting plants against one another in unofficial contests. Workers raced to break monthly output records. Newspapers celebrated milestones. A cultural momentum formed, a belief that exceeding impossible goals was itself a patriotic act. This collective momentum had a psychological dimension Göring could not comprehend. In the Reich, fear held the machine together. In America, ambition did. The final ingredient of the American industrial miracle was its fusion of engineering innovation with mass production. As the war progressed, aircraft designs improved rapidly. The P-51 gained the Merlin engine, the B-29 introduced pressurized cabins and remote-controlled turrets, and the Navy refined carrier-borne aviation, using production feedback loops unheard of in Europe. Engineering did not end when production began. It evolved continuously, fed by combat data and factory ingenuity. The Luftwaffe inherited this reality late and unwillingly. Göring had wagered that Germany's elite engineering tradition guaranteed superiority. But elite craftsmanship could not compete with mass innovation. A single American plant could outproduce Germany's entire fighter program, and if a design flaw emerged, it could be corrected across thousands of aircraft within weeks. In the end, the very characteristics Göring had ridiculed, American mass culture, consumerism, decentralization, diversity, became the tools with which the United States built a war machine that rendered his worldview obsolete. The American industrial mobilization was not an accident of geography or resources. It was a national act of imagination, a willingness to reinvent the civilian economy from top to bottom. It was the triumph of systems thinking over intuition, of flexibility over rigidity, of inclusive labor over ideological purity. By 1944, American aircraft production did more than outmatch Germany. It overwhelmed it. The Luftwaffe could not replace its losses. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Veteran pilots disappeared faster than replacements could be trained. Strategic initiative shifted permanently to the Allies. Göring had mocked 50,000 planes. America nearly doubled it. The lesson was clear. The war in the air would not be decided by dogfights alone, but by the factories capable of replenishing the sky. By early 1944, Göring's laughter had faded into a bitter, unspoken anxiety that permeated the Luftwaffe's headquarters. The crisis did not erupt suddenly. It advanced like a shadow consuming the horizon, slow at first, then all at once. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich and the instrument with which Göring hoped to dominate Europe, was collapsing under the sheer gravitational pull of American air supremacy. The skies above the Reich had transformed from symbols of German dominance into vast, silver arenas where the Luftwaffe was outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outmatched. The first cracks appeared in pilot attrition. The Luftwaffe had entered the war with arguably the finest cadre of aviators in the world, men hardened by the Spanish Civil War, trained under exacting standards, and celebrated as embodiments of German martial prowess. But wars of attrition do not reward excellence. They punish shortages. As the Allies intensified their air campaigns, Germany began losing pilots faster than it could produce them. The Luftwaffe lost 1,000 trained pilots in the first half of 1943 alone, many of them irreplaceable veterans whose experience had forced the training system, once methodical and rigorous, was forced into triage. Courses were shortened from months to mere weeks. Hours in the air, the lifeblood of a pilot's development, were slashed so brutally that some cadets graduated having barely mastered takeoffs and landings. The pressure to replenish the front line was overwhelming, and the result was a tragic inversion. Germany sent boys to fight seasoned American and British aviators whose training pipelines were expanding, not collapsing. This disparity between experience and inexperience widened with every passing month. American pilots trained in vast open skies, with abundant fuel, extensive flight hours, and a doctrine that emphasized adaptability. German trainees, starved of fuel, restricted by Allied bombing, and rushed through truncated programs, entered combat already at a disadvantage. Many died within their first few missions. The Luftwaffe's numerical losses were severe. The psychological toll was devastating. But the true death sentence for the Luftwaffe came from resources that could not be replaced: fuel and airframes. The American bombing campaign against synthetic fuel plants began as an irritation and ended as a catastrophe. Targeting facilities at Luna, Politz, and the Ruhr, Allied bombers dismantled the Reich's ability to convert coal into aviation-grade fuel. By late 1944, German aviation fuel production had plummeted by more than 90%. Luftwaffe squadrons that once trained daily were grounded for weeks. Elite fighter groups, units that once prided themselves on their aerial mastery, could barely sortie enough aircraft to maintain a semblance of operational readiness. Fuel scarcity created a vicious cycle. Without fuel, pilots could not train. Without training, they died in combat. As losses mounted, the Luftwaffe became a hollow force. Planes without pilots, airfields without planes, commands without coherent strategy. Meanwhile, American production surged with almost mathematical indifference to losses. A bomber shot down over Berlin could be replaced by another rolling off a Michigan assembly line the same week. American fighter groups deployed new aircraft in batches that Germany could not match in an entire season. When the P-51 Mustang arrived in mass formations, escorting bombers deep into the heart of the Reich, it marked the beginning of the Luftwaffe's final eclipse. The P-51 was more than a fighter. It was a strategic weapon. With its long-range capability, it denied the Luftwaffe the one advantage it had relied upon since the start of the war: the ability to strike bombers only after they had outrun their escorts. Now, American bombers arrived with their own guardians, fast, maneuverable, and present in such numbers that German formations had no room to maneuver. The Luftwaffe's losses became catastrophic. Veteran pilots were hunted methodically, and within months, the backbone of Germany's fighter force was broken. The skies over the Reich, once filled with the snarling engines of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, became domains of vulnerability and fear. Reports from frontline units became grim poetry of despair. Too many enemies, fuel insufficient, losses unsustainable, no relief in sight. Even as Germany introduced advanced aircraft, the Me-262 jet, the Do-335 Pfeil, the He-162, none arrived in quantities sufficient to alter the balance. The Me-262, hailed as a wonder weapon, was hampered by Göring's interference, Hitler's misguided tactical demands, and the destruction of jet engine factories. It was the fastest plane in the world, but speed cannot replace strategy. A few hundred jets, flown by exhausted pilots with minimal training time, could not counter thousands of American fighters and bombers swarming across Europe. The German aircraft industry, operating under bombardment, began cannibalizing itself. Ersatz materials replaced aluminum, wooden components were substituted for metal, quality control disintegrated. Cracks appeared in wings, engines failed prematurely, and assembly defects rose alarmingly. These problems were not the result of incompetence, they were the result of desperation. In the face of this accelerating collapse, Göring retreated into denial. When air raid sirens wailed over Berlin, he insisted that the Reich's air defenses remained formidable. When fuel shortages crippled fighter groups, he blamed disloyalty among industrial workers. When American fighters swept the skies with impunity, he accused pilots of cowardice. This self-deception intensified, even as Allied air power achieved operational dominance across every front. American tactical air forces isolated battlefields, destroyed retreating German convoys, and severed supply lines with surgical brutality. Thunderbolts and Mustangs roamed the skies of France, Italy, and later Germany itself, turning any daylight movement into a hazard. Luftwaffe commanders were forced to hide aircraft in forests, barns, and tunnels, measures that symbolize the crumbling of an air force once heralded as invincible. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Units listed dozens of aircraft but could field only a handful. Pilots flew missions with barely enough fuel for combat engagement. Maintenance crews worked without spare parts, improvising repairs that barely held airframes together. Airfields became graveyards of wrecks and half-built prototypes. Meanwhile, the Americans kept building, not tens, not hundreds, but thousands of aircraft each month. The sheer scale of production allowed the U.S. Army Air Forces to rotate units, train pilots extensively, upgrade equipment continuously, and sustain losses that would have annihilated any other nation. In strategic terms, American air power had become a hydraulic force, constant, overwhelming, and impossible to resist. The collapse of the Luftwaffe was not a single event, but a slow, grinding implosion, driven by three converging pressures: lack of fuel, lack of trained pilots, and lack of replaceable aircraft. Each pressure alone could have crippled an air force. Together, they guaranteed its destruction. The tragedy, and the irony, was that this collapse originated in Göring's own complacency. Had he recognized the threat in 1941 or 1942, had he reformed training pipelines, decentralized production, or confronted Hitler's meddling, the Luftwaffe might have withstood the storm for longer. But Göring had mocked the storm itself. He had laughed at the idea that America could build 50,000 planes. By the time he stopped laughing, America had built almost 100,000. The end came not with a dramatic duel in the skies, but with silence. The silence of grounded squadrons, empty fuel tanks, and airfields that no longer launched fighters to intercept the bombers overhead. American planes flew with such impunity over German cities in 1945 that civilians described them as the silver ceiling, a permanent presence that defined the end of the Reich, not with a single decisive blow, but with a continuous, unrelenting dominance. Göring's promise that no enemy bomber would reach German soil became one of the most bitterly remembered failures of the war, not because he was wrong in prediction, but because he never understood the world that made him wrong. He fought a war of craftsmanship against a war of mass production, a war of elite pilots against a war of systematized training, a war of ideology against a war of industry. In that mismatch lay the seeds of the Luftwaffe's destruction. America did not outfight the Luftwaffe. It outbuilt it, and once the factories turned the balance, the collapse was inevitable. There is a moment, late in the war, that captures the full psychological tragedy of Hermann Göring's failure. In a bunker beneath the shattered ruins of Hall, his once lavish estate, Göring stared at a Luftwaffe situation map dotted with red arrows representing American bomber streams. The arrows clustered so densely over central Germany that they resembled veins pulsing across a dying organism. An adjutant, hesitant but dutiful, reported that fuel reserves were gone, fighter units were spent, and jet deployments were impossible. Göring listened in silence. Then, as if speaking to ghosts rather than men, he muttered, "If only they had feared us, as we believed they must." That confession revealed what statistics could not. The collapse of the Luftwaffe was not merely industrial or strategic, it was ideological. The Reich had built its military identity on superiority, racial, cultural, and spiritual superiority. And when confronted with a nation that defied these assumptions, its leadership could not adapt. The tragedy of Göring's blindness is inseparable from the psychological architecture of the Nazi regime itself. From the beginning, Göring believed that war was an arena where willpower triumphed over machinery. He inherited from World War I a romanticized vision of air combat. Knights of the sky, aces dueling above the trenches, heroism surpassing industrial scale. This mythology fused seamlessly with Nazi ideology, which preached that German destiny flowed from biological virtue rather than economic capacity. Strength, in this worldview, was not built, it was innate. Superiority did not need proof, it needed only assertion. Thus, when Göring mocked American industrial goals, he was not making a technical prediction, he was defending a worldview. To admit the possibility of American supremacy in aircraft production was to admit that German superiority, so loudly proclaimed, so deeply woven into the regime's identity, might be an illusion. And illusions were the oxygen of Nazi leadership. The psychological consequences of this belief system were profound. Göring surrounded himself with officers who echoed his views. Reports that clashed with his expectations were softened or suppressed. Pessimistic assessments were treated as betrayal. Ideology turned the Luftwaffe's command into a hall of mirrors, where Göring saw only the reflections he wanted to see. This self-reinforcing delusion explains one of the most perplexing aspects of Göring's conduct, the way he interpreted American abundance as decadence rather than potential. A society that produced cars, radios, refrigerators, and consumer goods on a massive scale struck Göring as unfocused, materialistic, soft. He never considered that the same factories, powered by the same workers, and guided by the same engineering ethos, could be transformed into the most formidable industrial arsenal the world had ever seen. But ideology is not merely a lens, it is a cage. Göring's belief that democratic societies were too chaotic to organize for total war blinded him to the flexibility of American institutions. He believed that only authoritarian command could mobilize a nation. But American mobilization was not ordered from above, it surged from below. It was participatory, inventive, and competitive, qualities antithetical to Göring's worldview, and therefore invisible to him. This blindness extended beyond industry and into psychology itself. Göring believed that Germans fought with a purity of purpose unmatched by other nations. The Luftwaffe's early victories reinforced this myth. Poland, Norway, France, the Balkans. But as the war expanded and the skies filled with American aircraft, the myth of intrinsic superiority became a psychological trap. Every defeat required a new rationalization. Every setback had to be blamed on traitors, poor weather, or insufficient will, never on structural weakness or the enemy's strengths. Perhaps the most tragic victims of this ideological rigidity were the young pilots Göring sent into a war he no longer understood. Teenagers, barely trained, were ordered to confront American bomber formations guarded by seasoned Mustang escorts. Göring told them that German courage would overcome the odds. But courage is not a substitute for fuel, training, or aircraft. Many of these pilots never returned from their missions. Their sacrifice was not the result of strategic necessity, but ideological blindness. Even in the final months of the war, when the skies over Germany were dominated entirely by American and British aircraft, Göring insisted that miracle weapons would reverse the tide. This faith in technological salvation, jets, rockets, prototypes that existed more in imagination than in operational reality, reflected a psychological need to believe that German genius would triumph despite every material disadvantage. It was a belief detached from the world, a belief sustained by fear of truth. This psychological rigidity permeated the entire Nazi leadership. Hitler shared Göring's contempt for America, dismissing it as a mongrel nation incapable of endurance. Goebbels portrayed American industry as bloated and inefficient. Himmler insisted that spiritual strength would defeat economic strength. Together, these convictions formed a worldview in which acknowledging American production power was unthinkable. But the world does not respect ideological comfort. It respects numbers, logistics, fuel, coal, steel, and workers who show up every morning. The Reich built its strategy on myth. America built its strategy on machinery. The psychological collapse that followed the industrial collapse was inevitable. By 1944, many Luftwaffe officers understood the truth that Göring refused to face. They were fighting an enemy whose strength flowed from a social and industrial model fundamentally different from anything the Reich could imagine. They were fighting a nation not bound by ideology, but by capacity. The final measure of Göring's blindness came not from his enemies, but from his own subordinates. In late 1944, a Luftwaffe general, exhausted and exasperated, remarked, "We are fighting a war against a factory, and the factory does not tire." In those words lay the essence of Göring's failure. He had believed that war was a test of spirit. America showed that it was a test of systems. He had believed that destiny was inherited. America showed that it was manufactured. He had believed that superiority could be declared. America showed that superiority had to be built, month after month, on assembly lines stretching from Detroit to Dallas. The collapse of the Luftwaffe was the collapse of an idea, the idea that ideology could triumph over industry, that will could replace resources, that myth could outbuild machinery. Göring had imprisoned himself in a worldview incapable of understanding the modern world. And that worldview, more than any bomber or fighter, ultimately doomed the Reich's Air Force. When the war finally ended and the skies above Europe fell silent, the ruins of the Luftwaffe stood as a monument to a miscalculation so vast that it reshaped the very meaning of modern warfare. Hermann Göring, once the architect of the most feared air force on Earth, found himself confronted not by armies that had outmaneuvered him, nor by aces who had outdueled his pilots, but by a truth he had denied until the end. The power that defeated him was industrial, systemic, and democratic. America's aircraft production peak, 96,270 planes in 1944, was more than a statistic. It was a declaration that the character of warfare had changed. It marked the moment when victory was no longer dictated solely by the brilliance of generals or the bravery of soldiers, but by the capacity of a society to marshal its resources with unprecedented coordination. It proved that factories could be as decisive as front lines, that assembly lines could shape strategy as surely as commanders, and that a nation's industrial imagination could determine the fate of continents. Göring's laugh in 1943, boisterous, derisive, triumphant, became in hindsight the symbolic beginning of his downfall. It captured the arrogance of a regime that believed ideology could substitute for reality. It captured the blindness of a leadership that underestimated its enemy because it misunderstood the world itself. And it captured the tragic distance between belief and truth, a distance measured not in meters or miles, but in aircraft built, pilots trained, and cities defended or left exposed. Yet the legacy of this story extends far beyond Göring, beyond the Luftwaffe, and even beyond the war itself. The American aircraft miracle of World War II reshaped global strategy for generations. It demonstrated that free societies, when challenged, could mobilize with a force that dictatorships often failed to anticipate. It proved that diversity, decentralization, and competition, qualities Göring mocked, could become engines of wartime innovation. And it established an industrial precedent that defined the Cold War, the Jet Age, and the future of global military power. But perhaps the most enduring lesson lies in the confrontation between ideology and evidence. Göring's worldview, rigid and self-assured, could not bend without breaking. He believed that superiority was inherent, not constructed, that destiny flowed from heritage, not labor, that a nation's strength was measured by its proclamations, not its production schedules. When reality contradicted these beliefs, he rejected reality. This pattern, leaders trapped by their own ideology, unable to adapt when the world changes, has echoed throughout history. From empires that underestimated their enemies to regimes that dismissed the power of technology or the resilience of free societies, the downfall often begins with the same gesture Göring made, a laugh, mocking what should have been feared. In the final days of the Reich, as American aircraft swarmed the skies with unchallenged dominance, Göring's earlier words hung in the air like a bitter prophecy. He had promised that no enemy bomber would reach Germany. Instead, they reached it in thousands, escorted by fighters the Luftwaffe could no longer resist, produced by factories he never believed could exist. His promise became a symbol not only of military failure, but of the peril of ideological arrogance. What remains, then, is the contrast between two visions of power. One, rooted in myth, rigid and exclusionary, blinded by its own certainty. The other, rooted in industry, flexible, adaptive, and open to the energies of an entire society. In this contrast, the story of America's wartime aircraft production becomes more than history. It becomes a reminder. A reminder that strength is built, not declared. That potential grows when societies trust their people, not when they restrict them. That the engines of victory are forged not only in laboratories and command posts, but in the hands of ordinary workers whose contributions define the arc of nations. Hermann Göring once believed that America's goal of 50,000 aircraft a year was a joke. History answered him with nearly 100,000. And in that answer lies the legacy of the war in the air, a testament to human ingenuity, to industrial democracy, and to the power of a nation that refused to accept limits, least of all the limits imagined by its enemies.